Question: should I build my next villain lair above the screaming abyss, among the green fires of the Plague Mountain, or hidden among the eldritch shadows of the Forsaken Realm? Or should I go with that nice Victorian house down on 4th and Walnut because it has a really good school district? Location, location, location. Well, today we're going to talk about location as a storytelling tool on this episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide, and I am here with a message for all of the new and aspiring game masters out there. You will know when you have arrived as a storyteller by your ability to achieve a TPK with a completely empty room. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are doing the second video in my Crafting Your Campaign series. This is a series of videos that is aimed primarily at new or aspiring GMs to help you through the art and science of building a campaign. Often, the idea of stepping behind the Game Master screen for the first time can seem a little overwhelming. So the idea behind this series is to take some of the different elements or pieces of storytelling and break them down to give you, the aspiring DM, a selection of tools that you can draw on with the hope that you'll be able to build some fantastic games and some fantastic stories yourself. However, everyone is welcome to stick around and be a part of the conversation. Maybe you're an experienced DM looking for some ideas to help with your campaign, or maybe you've never thought about DMing, but you're just a little curious about what goes on. Who knows, maybe this series will inspire you to take a shot at storytelling yourself. Throughout this series, we're going to be talking about several different elements of storytelling and looking at them individually to see how they are used in crafting a campaign. And today we're going to be talking about the first element of this series, which is location. We're going to be talking about how to use place as a way to develop and enhance your stories. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things you may want to keep in mind when you're thinking about location to help improve the stories you may want to tell. This video is going to be broken up into roughly 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about the basic concept of location. We're going to be talking about location as place. Then, we're going to dig a little bit deeper and we're going to talk about location as an element of storytelling. Finally, towards the end of this video, I'm going to do a short aside on the subject of maps and my thoughts on how you can develop, find, or use maps in your own game. I will go ahead and admit that last section will be a little bit brief, but that is one question that was recently brought up to me, and I thought that this conversation was an excellent place to address my thoughts on that issue. So, let's get started. Now, as I said, this is the second part in my Crafting Your Campaign series. If you haven't seen the first part in the Crafting Your Campaign series, I'm going to try to put a link somewhere up here that you can click on to go to that first video. But there is a core principle I would like you to keep in mind throughout this entire series, which is don't let the art and science of storytelling overwhelm you. Storytelling truly is the art of building the plane as you're flying it. Even the most prepared of storytellers has to master the art of spontaneity, of creation as you go. There is no story that survives first contact with your player characters, I promise you this. So, when you're looking at storytelling, please do not let these different elements and concepts overwhelm you. These are tools to help you, not a mountain that you have to climb. And I hope that that distinction alleviates some of the concern or stress that you might be feeling. So let's begin with our first element of storytelling, which is location. And very simply, location is ultimately a description of place. That's really all it is. Where are you? Are you on a mountain? Are you in a swamp? Are you in a church? Or are you in a castle? There are a million different concepts for where a character might be, and in every instance, location serves as a backdrop for the story that is being told. If you need an example of the power of location, just take a look at the 9-hour New Zealand tourism series, The Lord of the Rings trilogy. I love those movies. I'm not making fun, but it is what it is. They definitely took advantage of the location to get some pretty beautiful shots in those films. So today we're going to talk about location, and when we talk about location in storytelling games, I think the most basic, the simplest version of location that we can discuss is literally a square on a battle map. It is your character's location in the middle of this particular encounter, room, dungeon, whatever it may be. And please don't think that I am oversimplifying things here. That simple concept of which square your character is standing in on the battle map can be a very powerful thing. If you are jumping behind some rocks to avoid a dragon's breath, your location on that map is powerful. If your character is standing between two enemies, you are suddenly flanked and your location matters a lot. Even something as simple as setting a figurine on a map can have powerful implications for your story, and I want to go ahead and reveal an important element of location here. Location helps define relationships. Think about it. If you have two characters standing on opposite sides of a battle map, you have a pretty good indication of the relationship between those two characters. Now, we will get into location and relationship later when we talk about location as a storytelling tool, but for now, I do want to highlight location is a powerful tool in helping you as a storyteller establish relationships in your game. Still, stepping away from storytelling elements, let's go back to that earlier idea of location as a backdrop. Usually, when we think about location in role-playing games, it's that backdrop concept that helps add some excitement, helps add some interest to our games, and often we approach the concept of location by asking, how can I make my game more exciting or more interesting? And this is a good first stop for new storytellers. If you want to use the tool of location in your games, that's an easy thing you can ask. How can I change the location of my characters to make an encounter more interesting? A few days ago, I was watching an old Jackie Chan movie, and I don't remember the name of the movie, but I definitely remember the fight scene. Jackie Chan had a fight scene against two particular mook villain characters, and first he fought one character one-on-one, then he fought the other character one-on-one, and then eventually he had to fight both characters at the same time. It was a pretty simple fight scene. But there was a twist. If you know Jackie Chan movies, you know that they weren't just fighting in the middle of a room. No, this particular fight scene took place on the top of a skyscraper, and at several points during this fight scene, Jackie Chan and these other two combatants were battling literally on the edge of a building, and one simple misstep would have sent a character plummeting to their death. Naturally, this made the fight scene a lot more interesting, and this is a simple trick that you can pull off as a storyteller. When you're planning a fight scene or an encounter, ask yourself, what can I add to this location to make it more engaging? Simple examples are things like cover, making ranged combat both more difficult and more interesting. If you have a map that has particular choke points, then it becomes a lot easier for your players to employ defensive tactics during the encounter. Or, if the enemy is behind a choke point, it makes it a lot more difficult for your players to attack their foes. Even simple tactical considerations like that can up the interest that your players have in the session. Now, there are a lot of different varieties here, and I'm not going to try to list every single possibility, but really the best research you can do for this particular element of location is watch a lot of movies and TV shows, read a lot of books, and steal the ideas that jump out to you. If you see a particular scene in a movie or if you read a particular encounter in a book and it's more exciting because of the location, that's something you can very easily steal and use as a storyteller to help bring some more interest and excitement to your games. Still, when we discuss location as a tool for storytelling, we do need to step back and look at a broader picture than just a tactical battle map. Really, at this point, we're getting into a discussion of geography. And by the way, as a general tip for storytellers, there's an old saying, not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers. As a storyteller, you are a leader in your gaming group, and part of being a good leader is being a good reader. The art and science of storytelling is often the art and science of being curious and being willing to go out and read and explore various ideas out in the world, and then bring those ideas back to your gaming table. When we discuss location, one of the best subjects that we can read about is geography. Now, I don't expect you to go out and do a college level course on geography just to be able to storytell a game, but you can look for books or texts that discuss elements of geography to help inspire you when you're storytelling. Really quick, 2 books that I think are very easily applicable for a storyteller would be Guns, Germs, and Steel and The Art of War. Both of those books discuss geography and discuss them in a way that I believe any storyteller out there is going to quickly see elements that they can incorporate into their game to help make the game more appealing. Still, for a discussion of geography in general, when we look at the concept of location, ultimately what we're really asking is, what are the resources in a given location? That's really what geography is. When you look at a place, what's there? Or, I guess more appropriately, why would people go there? If a place has nothing of value or nothing of interest, people aren't going to be there. Your adventurers aren't going to show up. People go to locations for a reason. And geography is often a study and a discussion of what resources might be available in a given area. And resources here is a very broad term. It can describe a lot of different things. When we think about civilization, one of the big ones is food and water. That's why so many cities and so many prominent settlements appear alongside rivers and lakes and things like that. Access to water is essentially a foundational element for most strong communities. Exceptions do exist, but we don't have time to chase every single rabbit here. When you're talking about resources, one of the resources that might bring people to a location is the food and water that is present. However, outside of those basic things, you have other resources. You might have economic resources. Imagine things like a diamond mine or a gold mine, which are classic adventuring locations in many a fantasy story. Having access to special materials or special minerals could be a strong motivator for people to want to go to a particular location. Outside of specific resources, there are other economic considerations. A location may not have much to speak of in terms of resources, but its proximity to an important trading route could be a major reason for people to want to control a given location. Speaking of control, let's talk about the military. Military leaders might look at a location through a number of different lenses when they are evaluating how easy it is to defend a location, how easy it is to launch an attack from a location, and what sort of logistical supports might be available for military units kept at a given location. It is a common attribute of strategic games to seek out places on the map that give competing factions a strategic advantage when they go into battle. However, there are other reasons that groups of people might seek to control a location beyond just military considerations. Think about cultural or religious significance that may be associated with a given location. How many fantasy stories have a sacred mountain, or a sacred river, or a sacred lake that supposedly has a greater connection to the spiritual world? It would make sense for a community of people to naturally gravitate to that location if they have a desire to draw closer to the spiritual world. This is another resource that a location might offer. And you can expand beyond just religious ideas to a lot of different cultural ideas. Think of places like Nashville and Las Vegas in the real world. If you're a musician, Nashville is a place you might naturally want to move because of the prominence of the music industry in that city. By the same token, if you're interested in maybe some more chaotic neutral activities here in the United States, there's more than a few people who would head to Las Vegas for exactly that reason. When we talk about location, what we're ultimately doing is discussing the resources that might draw a group of people to a location with an interest in accessing or exploiting those resources. Now, before we move on, there is one resource that I want to point out in particular that is important to keep in mind in role-playing games, which is magical resources. Any mundane location can become a lot more important if it has an unusual magical resource in your story. Classical examples in fantasy and fiction would include things like ley lines as a sort of special magical resource that a person could access at a place. So, when you're storytelling, when you're thinking about location as a place, when you're discussing the geography of your game, really what you're asking yourself is, what resources might draw people to this location, and as an extension of that, what sort of conflicts would occur in trying to acquire those resources? So that is a really quick breakdown of location as place. Location is ultimately a description of where someone is relative to someone else or something else. And when we discuss location, we're often discussing the geography, which really is a question of resources that would draw people to that place. Now, those are the physical basics to consider with location. But now, let's move over to location as a storytelling tool. With all of the storytelling tools that we're going to be talking about in this series, what I intend to do is I intend to look at this particular piece, location, and how it pairs up with the other pieces that we will be discussing in this series. There will be a little bit of overlap from video to video, so I'm going to try to focus mostly on the location part of pairing things up in this video, and in future videos we'll dive deeper into the other half of such pairings. But one of the things you want to do as a storyteller when you're using these different tools is ask yourself, how can this tool enhance my story? Now, we already said location helps define relationships. Two people on opposite sides of a battle map. Their relationship is defined by the conflict that we know is about to occur thanks to the literal battle lines that are drawn on our map. When you think about location, often what you are doing is helping to define the relationship that your player characters are going to have with the other characters in the story, and trust me, location is extremely powerful. Let me give you 3 different locations, and you tell me if you think that the location would change the story. The setup is this. The king's most trusted advisor has called on your player characters to meet with him, and he has an important matter that he would like to discuss. In the first story, you will be meeting with the advisor at the king's palace. In the second story, you will be meeting with the advisor at a military tent on the front lines of the latest battle. And in the third story, you will be meeting the advisor secretly in a rundown inn in a shady part of town. The setup is the same in all 3, and yet I guarantee you instantly recognize that all 3 of those stories are going to be very different from one another. By changing the location of encounters, of events that happen in your game, by shifting that backdrop that we discussed earlier, you are essentially changing the relationships that your player characters have, and in changing those relationships, it instantly creates drama and interest in your story. So one of the things that you should be asking yourself as a storyteller is, how can I change the location of my story to change the relationships that my players have? This is an extremely potent storytelling tool, but let's dive a little bit deeper. We're going to look at location as it pairs up with the other storytelling elements of this series, and first up is location and treasure. Now, this one I think is pretty obvious. Location can have a powerful effect on just what kinds of treasure you might present to your party. This goes back to the geography discussion earlier. What resources are available? If you help clear out the diamond mine that's been overrun with giant spiders, it is natural that you might be paid in diamonds. If the location of your latest adventure occurs on the front lines of a battle in a major war, then it is very likely that your players will probably be paid in military surplus gear as part of their reward for whatever it is that they did. Location has a powerful impact on what sort of rewards your players can expect. Don't believe me? Let me give you the greatest example of them all. The Dragon Horde. I think we all had similar images flash through our mind when I said that. My mind immediately flashes back to the incredible treasures collected by Smaug in The Hobbit. You have literal mountains of treasure hiding inside of this cave where Smaug the dragon lived, and if you can defeat the dragon, you can claim an absolutely absurd treasure as your own. As you can see, location has a powerful impact on the treasure and the rewards that players can expect. And when you're designing your adventures, one thing that you want to pause and consider is, what kind of treasure would be appropriate to this location? In fact, you can often motivate players to go to particular locations not necessarily because of the story that you want them to encounter, but because of the treasure that they might seek to find. Years ago, I ran a campaign where the players had the goal of building their own airship, and they had to figure out where they were going to get the different supplies that they needed, and I would give them options. You can go to this country or that country to get this particular supply, and they didn't necessarily know what story hooks were going to be in that location, but they did know that the resources were there. So that's how location and treasure interact. Let's go to probably the most fun discussion of this video: locations and villains. This topic naturally makes you think of the villain's lair. And believe you me, I love designing a good villain's lair. It is a classic trope of storytelling for a reason. There are few things as fun for a storyteller as designing a good villain lair, so I am not knocking that trope at all. But going back to our conversation on geography earlier, when we think about location as it relates to villains, what we're really trying to figure out is, what resources does my villain have? A villain who controls a strategic military choke point, and a villain who controls the best farming land in the nation have two very different resources, and probably would lead to two very different stories. Another thing to think about with locations and villains: if location defines what a villain has, it also defines what a villain needs. Here's a simple question. If your evil spellcaster villain wants to perform a terrible ritual to summon horrible evil things into the world, where are the components for that spell? As a more mundane example, maybe your villain controls important military points, but doesn't control important cultural or economic points inside their country. By defining the resources that your villain has and the resources that your villain needs, you very quickly begin to define the trajectory of a story. You know where your villain is, where he's going, and why he's going there, and that fills in a lot of the blanks that you need to fill as a storyteller. So that is a quick look at how locations interact with villains as a storytelling element. And speaking of villains, let's talk about player characters. I don't take that back, not for a second. Those murder hobos know what they did. Anyways, one of the elements that we're going to be talking about in this series is player character backstories. One of the elements of good storytelling is utilizing PC backstories well. One of the elements of a PC's backstory is, where are they from? Where is home for your player characters? As a storyteller, it is an extremely powerful and engaging thing to send your player characters home at some point during the story. Returning home is a very powerful literary motif, and returning home dramatically changed from what you used to be when you first lived there is a classic element of storytelling. It makes sense to let your PCs experience this. It's a common trope in writing, and there's no reason we shouldn't take advantage of this as storytellers. So ask yourself this question: where are my player characters from, and how can I send them back? I promise you the questions, the storylines, the twists and turns that you can write from this simple concept really do not end. Having your player characters return home can cause them to face former fears, or allow them to one-up a former bully. There are a lot of different stories you can write here, but I promise you that location, that home for your player characters, is a powerful story element, and you want to make sure you use it in your games. But let's talk about something bigger for a moment. The element of style or theme and how it relates to location. One of the things that I think storytellers should really stop and consider is, what is the style or what is the theme of the story that you are trying to tell? From there, you can stop and ask yourself, what sort of locations can reinforce this theme or reinforce this style that I want to use? A simple example would be, I want to tell a game about pirates. Location, boat. Other locations, there's a map with a big X on it. You know what you're doing. If you want to take the style of a pirate game, then naturally you want to select locations that are going to be important to that style of play. Beyond that, when we write stories, often we want to deal with particular themes or particular ideas that are very powerful. And location in those kinds of stories becomes a way of illustrating the important themes that we're using in our stories. Think for a moment about literally any post-apocalyptic story that you've ever read. Yes, in a post-apocalypse, you have a number of different dreary and dismal and terrible places that your heroes have to go, and in basically every one of those stories, I promise you, the location is a metaphor for human behavior. The Walking Dead didn't take the characters to prison for no reason, if you know what I mean. The setting becomes a way of expressing the themes of the story that you're telling. And so, when you're thinking about what are the big ideas of my campaign, what are the styles, what are the themes that I want to incorporate, use those questions to guide your thoughts to the locations that can best illustrate those different ideas. Some rapid fire examples. If you want to deal with the concept of isolation or loneliness, then your player characters should be as far from civilization as possible. By the same token, if you want to deal with concepts such as greed and corruption, then high society is definitely a setting you want to consider. In all of these examples, location reinforces the style, reinforces the theme, and these pieces fit together in a way that enhance the story you're trying to tell. Now, if you watched the first video, you know that one of the things I strongly recommend, it's not truly necessary to starting your first campaign, but I think it's something that you really want to look at. It's your first adventure and your finale. And I believe that the location of your first adventure and your finale are two of the most important set pieces in your entire campaign. They are the bookends. They are the first interaction that your character is going to have with this particular campaign world, and the last memory before your players leave this campaign world. And the location of these two stories have a lasting influence on how your story will be remembered. So as I have said, your first adventure and your finale are very important and something I strongly encourage storytellers to think about when they are planning a campaign. And because they are so important, the location of those two things has a powerful and lasting impact on your game. Now, usually when I storytell, I actually pick the location of the finale first. I'm serious about this. I want my game to end on a high note. I want my game to end on something dramatic. So as I said, one of the first things that I usually come up with as a storyteller is the location for the finale of my campaign. As a simple example, in the Galarian campaign setting for Pathfinder, they have the Starstone Tower, which is a tower where if you climb to the top of it, you get to face the test of the Starstone, and if you succeed at the test of the Starstone, you literally get to become a deity in the Galarian setting. And so several years ago, I decided that I wanted to use that, and I decided the finale of my campaign was going to take place at the Starstone Tower, and one of my players was going to get to pass the test of the Starstone. I picked that location. It was one of the earliest things that I did when I was writing that particular campaign. So I encourage you, really sit down and think, where is my campaign going? What is that last memory, that last moment going to be? And what backdrop can I use to make the finale of my campaign something truly epic and memorable? The other bookend to consider is the first adventure. Where are your player characters going to meet for the first time? What is going to draw them together the first time they battle together? What is the backdrop for that moment? Now, please allow me to be clear here, because there's an easy mistake to make in what I'm about to talk about. The scale of the first adventure doesn't have to be that big. You can have a small first adventure that brings your party together, that brings your players together, and helps them form that friendship for the first time. You don't have to jump over the moon to bring a group of people together, but I do believe that the first adventure should be memorable in some fashion. I always try to make that first adventure something truly unique. In a recent campaign, the location of my first adventure was shipwrecked on an uncharted island. That is a very memorable start to a campaign. You have a group of people who don't know each other well and find themselves struggling to survive on an unknown island with no idea how they're supposed to get home. In another campaign, I decided that all of my characters were going to be inside a quarantine zone after the plague began to run its way through a city. They found themselves locked behind some city walls, and the guards were not going to let them through because the plague was just claiming far too many lives. Now, both of those adventures were relatively simple. The players escaped the starting zone after about 5 or 6 sessions both times. They didn't have to do a lot to get out of those locations, but both of those locations were very memorable. Being trapped inside a quarantine zone with the plague threatening you, that is a very terrifying situation. Washing up on an uncharted island and having no idea where you are or how to get home, again, a very engaging first adventure. Let me just encourage you as a storyteller, when you are bringing your party together, you don't necessarily have to go big, but definitely try to go bold. Try to go for a first adventure that is going to stick with your party. Think of locations that are going to be very engaging for your players. And here's one of the great things about the first adventure. You can threaten your players with stuff that at high levels would not be that threatening. Like the shipwreck example that I just gave you. After a certain point, washing up on an uncharted island, your wizard's going to draw a teleportation circle, and that adventure ended 5 minutes after it started. At a certain point, stories like the Uncharted Island just aren't going to threaten your players. But a low-level party, oh my, that's a threat, and it is a truly, truly engaging location. So when you are designing your first adventure, really think about locations that you can pick that are going to be something your players will remember. I already shared the quarantine zone, I already shared the Uncharted Island. Another one that I did, my players were part of an expedition examining some forgotten ruins, and they triggered an ancient curse, and their camp started flooding, and they had to finish exploring the ruins before the flood caught up with them. Again, relatively simple, but very threatening and very memorable. Really spend some time asking, where can I set that first adventure where it is going to hook my players and really draw them into the story. A good location for your first adventure, I believe, is a powerful, powerful tool. So that is a quick synopsis of how location interacts with the other storytelling elements that are a part of this series. In each of these instances, location is ultimately informing or fleshing out different aspects of your story. By combining location and treasure, or location and villains, or location in your first adventure, what you're really doing is you're helping to flesh out and make those ideas bigger and more engaging. That is a pattern we're going to see throughout this series. As you take different pieces and put them together, it begins to form a larger, more complex, and more engaging idea. Take different ideas that you enjoy, find ways to put them together in fun and unique ways, and you will discover that you can paint a very beautiful picture using a few relatively simple pieces. A master storyteller is not this incredibly detailed book writer, but rather someone who can take a few interesting ideas and figure out how to string them together so that it becomes an exciting narrative for your players. Location is often seen as a backdrop, but really it's a powerful way of fleshing out the different elements of your story. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and say I don't have a lot to say here, it is the concept of map making. And the reason I don't have a lot to say is, hands down, I am a terrible artist. I just don't draw well. So if you're looking for good advice on how to draw maps or how to make maps, there are other channels out there where you're probably going to get a lot better advice. One of the ones that I would recommend is WASD20. His channel has no relation to my channel. He probably doesn't know I exist, but he actually does a lot of videos on fantasy map making, and he is a fantastic resource if you're looking for the how-to of doing maps for your game. Instead, what I want to talk about on map making is the concept of creating a map versus, okay, let's just say stealing a map. The reality is, the vast majority of storytellers are never going to be paid for this hobby. This is something you're doing for fun. So there is no harm in stealing something that you like and making use of it. In fact, authors and designers and game creators put material out there for you to use because they're hoping you will find it engaging. If you're getting started as a storyteller, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. If you can find something that is engaging to you, use those materials. And this applies to more than just maps, but it definitely applies to maps. If there is something that you really like that's been put out there by a game developer or has been put out there by other gamers, take that thing and run with it. Don't feel like you have to provide a completely unique world or a completely unique world map on your own. Now, I understand world creation is just fun. I've done it before. I have created unique settings for many different campaigns. One of my favorite unique settings that I created, I took the story of Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI, and I asked myself how I could overlap those two stories, and I ended up creating this weird hybrid prequel to those two games, and the map for that particular world was a custom map that was essentially a mix of some of the map elements from Final Fantasy IV and some of the map elements from Final Fantasy VI. I had a lot of fun building that world, but even there, I want you to notice that essentially what I did is I found some things that I liked from two different sources and combined them in a unique way to create my own game world. Even if you want to be a world builder, let me encourage you, take the time to look for things that you enjoy and ask yourself, how can I absorb these elements into what I want to create? If there's a particular village or villain's lair or adventure site or dragon graveyard, whatever it is, if there is something you see in another game that you really like, by all means, make use of it at your own table. It is a lot easier to ask, how can I use this, than it is to ask, what is something completely unique that I can invent entirely on my own? Now I will say this, it is always good to acknowledge the sources that you use. For my home games, I primarily use the Pathfinder setting, which is Golarion. Now my table has its own unique spin on what Golarion is, but a lot of my games are using the material that's put out by Paizo Publishing, and so I gladly give them credit for the excellent setting they've created. In the Final Fantasy game that I told you about, again, I give credit to Square Enix because I definitely took a lot of their ideas to create my own gaming world for that particular campaign. If you're a creative personality, you understand that we are often inspired from a number of different sources, and I think it is healthy and appropriate to acknowledge the source of our inspiration. If something was particularly beneficial to me, it's good to acknowledge it because it might also be beneficial to you. But don't feel bad about borrowing from other sources, or as I've said, stealing from other sources. Often that is the best way to help come up with something that's going to be unique and your own. Find something you like and modify it to something that you want. Now, as you become a more experienced DM, the concept of building your own truly unique world, that is definitely something that you can do, and it is definitely fun. As I've said, I've done it a lot in the past. Personally, right now, I really enjoy the Golarion setting, so I just keep using that one because it's very useful to me, but I definitely understand the impulse of the world builder. As you become an experienced storyteller, that is something you can definitely dive into, but when you're getting started, don't feel like you have to make those maps on your own. Don't feel like you have to design those locations on your own. Look to the excellent work of others and use that as the inspiration for your setting. So I know that this has been a really long video. Thank you for sticking with me through everything we've talked about today. We've been talking about location as a storytelling tool. We started out with the basic definition of location as a description of place. We talked about the small scale idea of location, which is essentially a square on a battle map, the location of your figure as it relates to the monster that you're fighting, and we talked about some simple ideas that you can use to enhance your battles by enhancing the features that are presented in that particular location. Things such as choke points, cover, different things like that. We then took a step back and talked about location as a discussion of geography, and I encouraged you to research into some of the ideas of geography, look for elements that you can incorporate into your games, and we talked about how truly geography is a study of resources. We said that every location that people want to go to ultimately draws people there because of the resources that are available. Whether it is food and water, or economic resources, military resources, cultural and religious resources, or in fantasy settings, never forget about the magical resources. When you consider a location for your game, one of the things you want to ask is what is present in this spot that might bring people to it. We then crossed over to location as a storytelling tool and talked about how location defines relationships. That changing the location of an encounter changes the context of the encounter and can make your story more interesting. As a simple example, an open meeting at a castle versus a clandestine meeting in the shady part of town tell two very different stories, even if you're meeting with the same person. When you think about location, think about the impact it's going to have on the relationships for your player characters in your game. We then went through location as it relates to the different elements that will be part of this series. We talked about how location defines the resources that might be used as treasure for your players. We talked about how location impacts your villains, not just in terms of the cool lair that they get to build, that is important, but also in terms of what resources your villain has and what resources your villain needs. And we talked about how that builds a very natural bridge for the plot of your game. We talked about player character backstory and the concept of taking your player characters home at some point in the adventure and the different narrative options that gives you as a storyteller. We talked about how location can become more than just a backdrop, but an illustration of the style and themes of your story as a means for illustrating the big ideas of the story that you're trying to tell. And we also talked a little bit about the time that you want to put into planning the location of your first adventure and your finale. These are the bookends of your campaign. It's the first memory your players are going to have and the last memory your players are going to have, so you want to make sure that those locations are powerful and engaging so that it will draw your players in and make your campaign something that your players are going to remember. Finally, we talked a little bit about maps, and I basically want to encourage you as a storyteller, if you're getting started, don't reinvent the wheel. Find something you like, beg, borrow, and steal, and use it at your gaming table. Every game master does it. It's perfectly okay. People put those things out because they enjoy them and they want you to enjoy them too. Though I do always encourage you, give credit where credit is due. If you have taken inspiration from a source, definitely acknowledge what that source is, because you may be introducing somebody else to a setting, a location, or a concept that they then can use at their own gaming table. So those are my thoughts on location as a storytelling tool. What did I leave out? Is there something that storytellers should consider when they think about location that wasn't part of this video? Leave your comments down below on other things that a storyteller should take into consideration when they're looking at the locations for their adventure. And if you have any other thoughts for elements that you would like to see included in this series, also throw that in the comments. I would be happy to add those ideas into the conversation that we're having. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. I have a whole bunch of different videos coming. I've been hit by a wave of inspiration lately, so I've got a lot of ideas that I want to do, and I look forward to sharing those things with you. Thank you for being a part of this conversation, and have a wonderful day.